All right. So hello, everyone. Herman and I are really pleased to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for Paul for the invitation and for having us tonight. For now, I'll just introduce us by sharing that Herman and I are both design principals at IBM, working out of the IBM Canada Lab. Herman works in IBM Quantum and I am part of IBM Software, and we'll tell you a few more details about ourselves in a bit. But before we get into our core topic on creating empathy for lived experiences, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the IBM Canada Lab where we work, as I'm told that the group might like to hear a little bit about that, as well as about the IBM Design Career Ladder and what design principles at IBM do. So IBM has offices, development labs, and design studios globally, but tonight we'll talk specifically about the IBM Canada Lab. The IBM Canada Lab is a very large development organization. We're the second largest within IBM itself and the largest in Canada. The lab team designs, codes, delivers, and supports software that's used around the world. So in a nutshell, we solve business problems. Pretty simple statement, but when you start thinking about all of the different software companies and technology companies around, a lot of them are focused on, sort of different demographics, and it's often helpful to tell people that we're working on enterprise software, and that is the crux of what we do. IBM has been in business for well over 100 years now, and the lab has been around for over 50 of those years. A number of the IBM solutions that have come out of the Canada Lab are listed here, and our solutions are relevant in various industries, supply chain, healthcare, and really our technology underlies and supports many other industries. You may be aware of our focus on AI and hybrid cloud, for example. So our teams are based out of 3 sites. Herman and I work out of the Markham in the GTA, but we also have Canada Lab sites in Fredericton and in Ottawa. And at the Markham site, we have one of the 2 design studios in Canada. There's another one in Ottawa, and the studio is made up of many collaborative working spaces, with one of the gathering spaces shown in the picture here. The studio has designers from various product teams that work within the same area, and all the developers, product managers, and clients on our teams into the space to collaborate with us. I forgot to mention at the beginning, Paul asked me to say I'd like to do Q&A. So just before I move on, if you want to note any questions in the chat or note them down and ask them by voice, we'd like to do that at the end. We're hoping that a discussion with all of not just in the chat, but we'll leave it to you to decide how you want to do that when we finish our presentation. We're hoping that what we share today will generate a great conversation at the end. So I'm moving on to talk about the design career framework at IBM. It's shown here, and IBM Design intentionally modeled this framework in our design leadership programs on what we have as an engineering career model or developer's career model at IBM, because that model has really been tested and it's been established for quite some time. But as a design organization, we also wanted to ensure that there was parity with the engineering profession, so that our designers really are able to move up the career ladder in a similar way that they do in engineering at the senior leadership positions. So if you are entering IBM from school, campus and early professional hires typically come in here at the band 6 level, and then designers progress up through the bands in their career as they broaden their scope, their skills, and experience influence within the organization. And you'll notice that once you get above band 9, there's sort of a split between the sort of technical career path and a management career path. Before you hit that band 10 level, promotions are at the discretion of the employee's business unit, but to move above that into band 10 or above in either the technical or the management contributor path, it's a much more rigorous process. So it involves a nomination process and the portfolio submission of the nominee's work in the technical path. They really look at examining your work, your experiences, and that's evaluated by a peer review board, and that's made up of executive level designers across IBM. So if we, in the whole scheme of things, IBM's design leadership population is still relatively small and compared to the engineering profession. The numbers are broken down here. We have one design IBM fellow, 13 distinguished designers, and 63 design principals. But it's a small community of thought leaders and innovators, and really our roles are to ensure that design and design thinking is sustained over time as part of IBM's culture. 4 of the 63 design principles are in Canada, Herman and myself, and we have 2 others, another person in IBM software, and then one who works in the services group. As I was mentioning, there's a process for becoming a design principal. The Design Leadership Board's process to appoint technical practitioners in leadership positions is pretty rigorous. And why is that? Really what IBM Design is looking for is to have designers have a seat at the table that is on par with engineering. So when you think about senior technical staff members and distinguished engineers and fellows within IBM, they're really looking for designers to be on par with those roles and really be involved in leadership across all of IBM at the highest level, and looking at that being sustainable. So first and foremost, design principals are nominated to fulfill a particular role, and that's put forward as part of the nomination, and their technical thought leadership roles. And at the fundamental level, those roles involve the advancement of design through scalable and reusable artifacts, through curriculum and creation of intellectual property. So you can see a number of the design principles in our organization here, and we work together to provide design leadership, business units, and service lines, and within our respective design studios to drive business and community growth. We are mentors across the organization, as well as advocates. And really, although we're affiliated with particular business units within IBM, we really are looking both across boundaries within IBM and also networking outside of the organization to advocate for IBM Design. Design principals are practitioners with really strong T-shaped design skills and a sustained level of achievement over time. Some of our design principals have been in IBM quite a long time, like Herman and myself, and others are newer to the organization and bring experience from outside of IBM that they contribute and become design principals once they join our organization. So moving on to tell you a little bit about ourselves. My focus as a design principal is on design research, and I practice in the area of enterprise applications in IBM software. So I'm engaged in research in supply chain, asset management, building management, weather business solutions like environmental intelligence. I have 2 teenagers, my daughter's 17 and my son is 15. I've been a passionate volunteer with youth organizations over time, especially in the area of STEM. My 15-year-old son, Adam, has cerebral palsy and uses a power wheelchair full-time. This is relevant to our presentation today. I've really become an advocate for accessibility and how I have an impact in that space in my work as a designer. In my spare time, I like to dabble in the dirt. I'm an experimental gardener, and I'm growing almost every type of perennial I can get my hands on in my garden, and pretty creative when it comes to Halloween. We're a big fan of homemade Halloween costumes. So I'm going to pass it over to Herman.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Okay, so my name's Herman Colquhoun, so that's how you pronounce that last name full of consonants. I'm also a design principal at IBM. However, my focus is on UX research and design for integrations within IBM Quantum. I'm the father of 2 young adult men. One's 22 and the other is 18. You'll often find me coaching at HBC design competitions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, HBCU is a historically Black college and university. And you'll find me also lecturing to engineering and information design classes. I'm also a volunteer instructor with Active Scholars, which is a local program that combines both sports camp and STEM camp activities. And you see me up in the upper right-hand corner here, teaching electrical circuit design and robotic programming lessons to kids that are from grades 4 to 8. In my spare time, I'm a bit of a sports enthusiast. I play ultimate frisbee along with my youngest son. You see here, I play basketball when we're not in pandemic mode, a volleyball, and a bit of fantasy football. And my last point on here is 2.3 running. That actually refers to a distance that I run in memory of Ahmaud Arbery, which you may or may not have seen in recent news as the jury is being formed or has just been formed. He was a 25-year-old young Black man who was shot and killed while jogging in his neighborhood because he, quote unquote, fit the description, which leads me into our current discussion about designing for inclusion in the lived experience. So today, Joan and I would like to take you on 2 days where we share our perspectives in promoting inclusive design. First, I will talk about my work as a leader within the racial equity and design team to explore and articulate the experiences of designer of color. And then Joan will share her experiences with accessibility and some of the things she's done with her team here at IBM to create something called accessibility lenses. And that helps bring the needs of people with diverse abilities into focus. And at the end, we will bring it all together with some of the results of an activity we conducted with our racial equity and design community to help answer the question shown here. How might we as designers create empathy for lived experiences? We will then open the floor to all of you to share your thoughts on the issue. All right. So the racial equity and design effort within IBM was carried out by 2 sets of designers you see here. Our leadership team, which I'm a part of, forming our first pillar of project support, and then our second pillar of non-Black designers who are necessary allies that are in the position to assist in effecting the changes that we seek to make. I'll be talking about some of the foundational work that I spun up with our team and how we were able to record and synthesize user interview data in such a way that we could easily see and understand the tangible differences between the Black and white designer career experiences at IBM. I reinvented and shifted our design toolkit in novel ways to create unique artifacts that drive the insights that were needed for addressing this problem space. So let me back up a bit and give you a bit of history on IBM's design program. So in 2013, shortly after becoming IBM's first woman CEO and chairman, Jeannie Rometty issued a directive to IBM and IBM Design to create a global sustainable culture of design and design thinking at IBM. And so here, I'd like to read a portion of this quote, and it's from a VP within IBM as well. So the last best experience that anyone has anywhere becomes the minimum expectation that they want to experience everywhere. Okay, so everyone now brings their consumer experiences to everything they do. Okay, it's no longer okay for us to just work. Everything is expected to be consumer grade. Everything is expected to be simple and delightful to use. Whether we realize it or not, user experience matters to us more now than ever before. So consider the engineering behind the traditional thermostat that you see here. Or sorry, this is not the traditional, this is a new one, but the traditional thermostat was different. And Tony Fadell, a former designer at Apple, he saw the expense and inefficiency and complexity with programming the traditional thermostat as a major problem, even as we went digital. So he created what you see here, which is the for Google. As a designer of 18 generations of iPods and 3 generations of iPhones, he applied all of his learnings to create a smart thermostat. Most people don't bother to program their thermostats for many reasons, but it really boils down to the fact that it's too complicated. But the Nest itself, it's great because it's so simple. It programs itself for your comfort, to save you money by learning your waking and sleeping habits. It knows when you're away, it knows when you're close to home, and it adjusts your energy consumption accordingly. But is this design racially inert? I'm not sure, right? And by this, I mean, when do we consider the impact of the social construct of race, the lived experience of the marginalized in our designs? So it might not be so straightforward here. Let me give you another example to illustrate this concept more directly. And remember that experience is the connective tissue. It's the central concept here. Okay, so now we think about the experience of hailing a cab. not really a great experience if you really think about it. You're standing outside exposed to the elements, especially if none of the caps stop. Have we shone a light on what arguably could be known as an equity problem? Maybe. We have maybe uncovered a racial bias issue here. This is a movie, Complexity. It uses a point of humor when Chris Rock hails a cab to prove a point to his love interest that it might be a near impossible task to have a cab actually stop for a Black man. All right, but let's continue with our scenario. You don't know when an available taxi will drive by or if one ever will. Technically it works, that old method works, and there was a time where no one knew any better. But then came what you see on the screen here, Uber. No more problems. With a simple tap, you can hail a ride, you can see how long it would take to get to you, knowing it's almost there, get dropped off at the destination, plug into the app at any time, and get out without having to deal with any paperwork or payment. It disrupted the entire industry. The design of the Uber experience is phenomenal. The Uber experience only seems trivial and obvious now in retrospect of all the engineering behind it, but they may have tripped upon a racial equity issue. And that brings us to the topic of diversity in the design for lived experiences. We all know 2020 happened, right? We all experienced this globally. Everyone had this experience. So we share it. The entire world was hit by the biggest immediate global challenge of our lifetime, right? The entire world also did this. It slowed down just enough to take notice of some challenges that have been around for a very long time. One challenge in particular, social justice, right? We just stayed quiet. We paused. We were at peace for just long enough to notice something that was wrong. In response to this, next slide, please. Eventually, a small IBM racial equity and design team was formed to begin looking at this question. How might design at IBM impact social justice? And we launched our racial equity and design community and Slack channel. So we looked at how to ensure racial equity is instilled in the design culture inside and outside of IBM. And we spun several initiatives to respond to the various needs voiced by our community. And the following is part of that journey. So in order to do that, we had to frame the problem. We had to look at it. What is it really? It is the essential human problem at the center of the issue. What is that essential human problem? Because we all are designing for people. We're all designing human experiences. So we have to look at what that problem is. So our area of focus, on the next slide, was that we would tangibly and sustainably impact the experience of Black designers at IBM and beyond. And the quotes you see here are from our former GM of design, Phil Gilbert. He said that racial inequity is steeped in the fundamental assumptions, behaviors, policies, and actions of the IBM corporate body. Therefore, affecting racial inequity is about changing those fundamentals. We can't claim to have a sustainable culture of design. Remember, Ginny said we needed to create a sustainable culture of design. So we can't have a sustainable culture of design and design thinking if we don't sustain a culture of racial equity and justice as a whole. All right, so several teams were formed to take this on and introspected parts of our culture within IBM Design. I was part of a work stream along with others that looked at the impacts of systemic race issues on career success in particular. So do we all accept that our current racial environment consists of marginalization that has affected people within our society based simply on their race? I think that question might be rhetorical at this point, right? So marginalization seeps into many of the aspects of life, whether it be race, whether it be physical ability or mental ability. you'll see as we move on with our talk. We also sought to observe the culture and look at how to establish a culture that better supports the recruitment, retention, and advancement of Black designers in this case, which is synonymous with establishing a culture of design success. All right, so we came to our community and we presented a problem statement. I spun up a sponsor user group consisting of 16 Black designers, 12 white designers, and 3 designers of color. And we charged them with the following challenge. We said, how might we improve the IBM designer experience at IBM for the Black designer, the white designer, or the designer of color, depending on which cohort I was speaking to, given both the current career trajectory and challenges, as well as the narrative of social and racial injustices, such as George Floyd's death. And we had the following goals. We wanted to highlight the pain points that were created, that created cultural and vocational tensions. And we also wanted to empathize with the struggle of the Black designer within IBM. So how did we go about doing that? Well, this piece in particular, we pulled together the Black community across IBM, and we asked them to look at ourselves as a community within IBM and tell us what the pain points are based on the Black experience. And so we found these different areas of pain points. 5 we identified being the highest priority. First and foremost being a lack of representation or underrepresentation within the IBM community. A low talent acquisition and retention rate, the lack of transparency and accountability and sustainability within IBM about race and diversity, and a lack of educational programs around this topic, as well as a lack of Black community connection from the industry to the communities in the surrounding areas. So the group also proposed ideas around how they thought we could address these problem spaces. So we collected up these ideas, we prioritized them, we mapped them, and some of them you can see here. Furthermore, what did we do? With those same 3 cohorts, the white designers, the designers of color, and the Black designers, we went through and we mapped the current career arc across designers of color in IBM. These formed several phases. So you'd have, like, phase 1 would be your formative years. How did you become a designer? The early career years, acquiring a job and entering your career within IBM. Mid-career, what does that look like? What does the transition in life at IBM look like for the different designers? And then the senior career. And if you look here, you can see that as we map the designers of color out and the activities, as you transition more and more throughout the career, you see the qualitative data starts to drop off. And the reason is that there is an imbalance. There are very few Black designers who are actually in the senior career hierarchies of IBM. So the data itself shows the flow. And so we mapped the patterns. We've discovered that designers come from 3 different tracks. You have designers that went to design school. You have designers that were educated in non-design areas, and then designers that were not educated at all, and either not going to university or not going to college or not going to design school, and having alternate ways of educating themselves and entering design. And then below, we show a number of pain points and clusters and areas. And if you can see, there's faint lines dotted lines that actually connect these areas. And it's an intricate network of issues that have impact downstream on what the Black designer actually experiences. So very early on in their career or in their formative years, we're seeing that there's things that could cause things like, the term's escaping me, but imposter syndrome. That's the term I was looking for. Thank you. Imposter syndrome, And imposter syndrome can be caused by various things, but if we look, as we look to the pain points that are included within this empathy, this tool that we use to gain empathy, we can see that imposter syndrome even starts from in the formative years, where support in the design industry was not given by certain families. They wanted their kids to be doctors or lawyers, or and areas like design weren't given a lot of respect. And then not having a clear path to design, that contributed to imposter syndrome. And then, in fact, because we remember there's not a lot of designers that look like us in the senior capacities, so there aren't a lot of people to give guidance back. And therefore, if we don't see people look like us, then we feel like maybe we don't belong. All right, let's move this forward. So we also did an empathy mapping exercise. So we did it for the Black designer and the white designer. And so one of the unique things that we found, if we overlaid these experiences, on the next slide, you'll see that we were able to create an empathy heat map. And so this was an interesting way of visualizing how experiences were what experiences were common and what experiences were not so common, or what experiences were unique to the Black designer. And in this empathy map, you can quickly see that the orange squares indicate experiences that were common across Black designers, white designers, and designers of color. The yellow stickies, or squares, were experiences that were unique to the Black designer. And then as you expand through the spectrum in between, that's any combination of the three types of designers. So we're able to focus in on areas where we could say, okay, well, what's the difference here in terms of what the designer of color, the Black designer, the white designer were experiencing, what they were saying, what they were doing, what they were feeling, and what they were thinking. Okay, as we progress on, we also use that information to then produce our traditional persona and convey the archetypical information about the shared experiences. And in particular, I was able to use diverging bar charts here to highlight areas that were affected most by marginalization and social impacts. So there's two aspects to this. There's Megan, who's the Black designer, and we have to, in order to better understand the Black designer experience at IBM, we need to see the world through Megan's eyes, right? So in listing this, the Black text that you see here is actually the text that's all unique to Megan. There's some gray, more difficult to read text that's there, but what that's meant to indicate is that text is common between the persona that we have created for Megan and the persona that we've created for the white designer. What's more interesting is under does and feels, where we have the diverging bar charts, we can use these. If we flip between the Black designer persona and the white designer persona, we can see things change. So let's, for instance, look at does. Megan goes beyond just design work. And you can see that bar is fairly filled. If you just skip down to near the bottom, Megan stays vigilant of her demeanor. That's also pretty full. She leads race discussions and education at work. That's also pretty full. Okay, so if we look at that bar chart and we flip to the next slide, we have Alex here, a white designer. So to better understand the Black designer experience at IBM, we also need to understand and contrast the world through Alex's excited eyes. But if we look at the things that Alex is doing in terms of going beyond just design work, you see that Alex may have some feelings that they've gone beyond design work, but not as much as Megan. If we go to the bottom and we look at the things, remember, we're charged with looking at, in the context of the climate of the happenings of George Floyd and the racially charged climate that we live in today, right? Alex does not stay vigilant of their demeanor. And Alex doesn't lead race discussions in education. That's loaded on Megan. So already you can see that there's differences and impacts that would affect the work of the everyday life of Megan to Alex. Alex, note that receives a lot of support and maybe have to advocate for themselves a bit, and that they have great success in acquiring sponsors. But if we flip back to Megan doesn't feel like she gets much support and has to advocate a great deal more for herself, and doesn't feel like she has success in acquiring sponsors and mentors as much as Alex does. But if we look over at now, put your attention over to the feel side. Alex feels, sorry, I'm gonna move everybody's faces out of the way on my chart here. Give me a second. Okay, so Alex feels very energetic, fulfilled the work, appreciated, doing well, coping with things, and excited about work. But if we flip back now, we'll see that Megan feels maybe a little bit less energetic and tired in these times because there's a lot of emotional fatigue hitting her. She might feel just as fulfilled by her work as Alex. She also feels a little bit exploited, overlooked, overwhelmed, and anxious. So these are the tools that we use to kind of convey and drive empathy for the differences in the personas and the different environments that we deal with. Okay, let's take a step back and look at what the broader problem that we're attempting to address. Okay, so moving on to the next, we have a Jacob Blake moment, we have the George Floyd moment. We understand that policing is an issue, but it's not one that we as designers, at least at IBM, are going to solve. The problem statement here is that there's no space to talk about or feel comfortable with racial equity issues and when support is needed. And we might have to we need something beyond just grinning and bearing it. But let's take another step back, okay? Step even further back at what is the larger issue that we pretty much need to deal with. How might we create empathy for the lived experience, the general lived experience, the marginalized lived experiences in a scalable and repeatable way? Okay, this brings us to another type of lived experience that we have perhaps all been more exposed to in designing for accessibility. Joan will speak more to that work.
Thanks, Herman. So Herman and I have been sharing our perspectives and work over the last few months, and we've learned a lot from each other, from our respective projects and the different things that we've been working on. And we've seen places where we think there's an opportunity to combine and borrow approaches and practices in these diverse spaces of accessibility and racial equity in design, and really think about those in terms of the lived experience. So today I'm going to share something that we're doing more broadly within IBM with the Equal Access Toolkit, which is available externally as well. The project that I've been working on accessible lenses, and then challenges that are still persisting after we've introduced this notion of accessible lenses and we have the toolkit, and then we'll circle back and say what's next and how does that come into inclusive design and the projects that Herman and I are working on together. So to get us all into the accessibility mindset, we all know how important accessibility is. About 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability, and 2 to 4% of that 15% experience significant difficulties in functioning. So having a disability actually places you in the world's largest minority group. And everyone will experience some kind of disability in their life. It's just reality, whether it's due to some sort of life circumstances, age, or some kind of injury. So IBM has always been a proponent for inclusion for quite a long time in different ways, and is it a proponent for equal access and accessibility. The IBM accessibility team has developed what's called the Equal Access Toolkit, and this is made available externally on the IBM.com site, so you're free to go and take a look at it in more detail. The toolkit looks at providing an end-to-end process for the design, development, and delivery of software and services. It provides tools and guidelines for all of the people who are involved in design, development, and delivery, whether you're a product manager, a developer, a tester, or a designer, there's something there for you. And the toolkit is available externally, as I said, and still evolving. So we're still building on it as a collective organization. The IBM accessibility team started with the essentials first, and the idea was they wanted to help teams move established and new products through to full accessibility and start from where they are. So what's in the toolkit today? You'll find information and education on the major standards, and there's really a effort here to bring them all together to help make sense of them as part of the toolkit. And it accounts for web and web software, documents and authoring tools, along with levels of compliance. And the tasks that are needed to be done by designers, developers, and testers and product managers are all laid out for each requirement along the way. The IBM design language also incorporates accessibility guidelines as shown here. And the design language is also available externally, and having that built in, the accessible design specifications built in automatically puts us a step forward in designing accessible solutions. There's also the carbon design system, so the other thing that's available that provides the code, design tools, and guidelines as part of that design system, and those are used across IBM. So the components have been built and documented with accessibility in mind. So you can see an example on the right for the checkbox component, talks about how it works, what the accessibility considerations are, and this is the same kind of structure for all of the components in the toolkit. But there's still room to grow. So even with all of these things available, designing for accessibility in reality, it's hard. Our designers complete the education and the badging, and they have the best of intentions, but we're working on large solutions in large organizations. And so we're still working on developing new processes and habits in support of accessibility and build those into the toolkit. An area that we noticed that we really had improvement needed was in the designer portion of the toolkit. We needed to integrate accessibility tools more with our designers' workflows and really look at how we're testing accessibility before the designs are actually coded. Currently, testing for accessibility is done on production level code, and changes once you get to that point, as we all know, can be really expensive. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and it relates to what I was just talking about. If you replace the word accessibility with inclusivity, it's kind of the same thing. But if you put the blueberries in after you bake, you're going to get burned, or the whole thing is going to fall apart. And really, it means that we need to understand before we design. So we need to make sure accessibility isn't just considered at the end of our process, and really we're thinking about our designers and how they may miss accessibility problems in their design changes that can be expensive. So we've already built some ways of them thinking about how to build accessibility in, but we're seeing that it really isn't enough yet. So this is what I had in mind when I took on a project and included some other members of my design team shown here, and the prompt that we were looking at is shown here. So how might we help our designers incorporate accessibility earlier in the design process and improve the inclusivity of our designs? So we wanted to really help that earlier incorporation and build empathy on the team for the broad spectrum of needs for the 4 disability types, and how could we evolve what was already available in the toolkit. Really what we were looking was shifting accessibility testing to the prototype phase, where we only had designs available, and providing tools that were integrated in the process. So what did we do? We created what we called accessibility lenses, and really what those are is a way to provide sort of an additive viewpoint that help our team, in addition to all of the other tools, look at our customers, users, personas with a different focus, an accessibility focus. And they really help our designers build or refresh their understanding of disabilities and corresponding needs, and how to design for those needs. And they're based on research that was collected across all 4 disability types, cognitive, hearing, visual, and motor. And we put those lenses up on an internal design portal, and this is the first page of that portal that's shown, and I'm going to dive into what's included in each of the lenses. So within each lens, we include from the research the incidence rates and the proportion of the people who are experiencing the disability. And the reason why we did that was we were finding that, you know, you have varying sort of interest and I guess people recognize that accessibility is important, but they see it maybe as an edge case as opposed to it affecting a large portion of the people that we're designing for. We're providing examples, causes, and conditions that lead to the disability, what accommodations are needed, such as the types of input devices and specialized software, technical challenges that need to be kept in mind as we work on our design, and empathy maps created from the research. I'm going to talk a bit about that and show those in a second. So and those are shown actually across the bottom of this chart. The toolkit actually was asking people to create empathy maps. And what we found was our team didn't have the level of understanding of all of the different types of disability as well as the spectrum of them in order to create those empathy maps themselves. So creating something that they could use as a basis was helpful. We also created a set of heuristics for each of the accessibility lenses that align with Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics. So with that, we were able to provide a tool for heuristic evaluation. And we built them into Mural as well as into Sketch, and we're working on one for Figma. And the idea here was to help the designers perform tests on the prototypes. So they could use the heuristics as they designed, and those can be sort of put right onto the canvas as they're working in the tool, but then they were able to also test by comparing the heuristics to their design and, you know, test with, ideally we would be testing on people who have the lived experience, but the reality for us is that it's really difficult to find people to test with across that spectrum with the frequency that we need to. So it's not to say that it's impossible, but we're still working on how to get that representation and access to those people. So we're now working on how we can take these tools and build them into that equal access toolkit I was saying, and looking at how that could be available externally as well. So what did we achieve? We refreshed focus on accessibility with our team. We have readily available education and tools to use earlier in the existing process. And we've helped people understand the intention behind the checklists. So some of the challenges we're still seeing is that, you know, some of these solutions that we have don't really scale to really large teams and really large products and projects. We have a lot of processes that are ingrained in our organization, and those can really die hard, and it can be difficult to sort of overcome those with our large teams. We're looking at such a broad spectrum of needs, and so trying to address that broad spectrum of needs, it's overwhelming. And there's a lot of time involved in trying to address those things. And then there's workplace pressures on top of that, like go to market and getting things out the door quickly. And often things like accessibility are the first thing to sort of get, you know, say, oh, well, we're going to get to that on the next release or whatever it is. And so really, those are things that we're looking to overcome. So one of the challenges with lived experiences is that we can only get so close. If you all think about trying to empathize with a community, and designers are really quite empathetic. It's really part of the designer DNA, if you think about it, to be empathetic. You can't design for something or someone if you can't really put yourself in their shoes. I haven't met too many designers who lack empathy, but no matter how empathetic you are and what information you have at your fingertips, you can only get so close. So think about other lived experiences, and I wanted to throw a few other ones out there to get you thinking about other lived experiences that you know you might have heard about, or maybe experienced yourself that you know that others find difficult to relate to. If you're a parent, but you've talked to people who aren't parents about some of your challenges, it's very difficult for them to fully empathize with what it is that you're going through. We see this with transitioning into the workforce too. If you think about being an academic and learning all of the theory around something, think about what you learned about design, and then you go out and in reality, try and put that into practice. Those are quite different lived experiences from the academia into the workforce. Think about on Remembrance Day, being a soldier. Very few of us, or I would say none of us who have not been into combat or into war are able to identify with that lived experience. Same thing, and I've got a typo on my slide here, sorry about that, experiencing a natural disaster, things like, you know, a tornado or any other kind of natural disaster. If you haven't experienced that and gone through the loss and the experience, it can be, it's pretty much impossible to identify and empathize fully with those lived experiences. So in a nutshell, unless you live it, it's all secondhand. So we can do our best, but we need to engage people with these lived experiences and do it consistently and routinely as part of our work and really integrate it further into our process. So I'd like to also share a small part of my lived experience as being part of my son Adam's life. Adam's motor disabilities require him to use supportive equipment for pretty much everything he does in daily life. And despite my proximity to him as his mom, I still feel like I have a limited understanding of what it must be like for him. My own experience of his life is still secondhand and it's observed. We've made huge strides in accessibility in the world, and we're seeing them in public spaces, products and services that are accessible to people with diverse abilities, no matter what they are, whether they're visual, hearing, motor, or cognitive, and we've really come a long way. But you know, something that becomes apparent with our lived experience is that things like lifts, ramps, sidewalks, entryways, etc., you know, the most critical things can be missed if the designers don't have firsthand experience, and working to checklists can miss a lot of things. We've seen numerous examples of this. There's a Wendy's nearby where we live, and there's the parking spaces, and the curb cuts that take you into the building actually take you into the drive-through traffic to get into the building. You actually have to drive into the drive-through from the opposite end to get into the entrance into the building. So working to a checklist sometimes doesn't cut it. They followed all of the guidelines. They have all of the things. They have accessible parking. They have curb cuts. They have buttons to open the automatic doors. But when it comes to the actual rubber hitting the road and you follow the path of the user more closely, it's pretty scary for anyone to come face to face with an oncoming car. But my point here is that you can have the best intentions and follow the guidelines and the checklists when we design and implement services, but we need to go further than that and test the experiences to make sure we have it right. I've met a lot of people with diverse abilities in my experience with Adam, and from them, we've learned that everyone's needs are different, and it's a really vast spectrum. Even if we're thinking about those 4 different disability spaces, there's a spectrum within each of them. Adam always has a companion with him and has challenges still getting into places, even if he's with me. I have no idea how people using wheelchairs manage alone, and I can't count the number of entryways where buttons to operate the door are too far away for someone to be able to get through the door before it closes after they've hit the button, especially where there's 2 sets of doors for climate control or privacy. And, you know, lastly, we really look at every challenge as an opportunity to educate or improve, and it's all about learning what works and what doesn't, and then figuring out how we can make it better and iterating. The pandemic brought an interesting opportunity with school at home, and that's what Adam's doing in this picture. He has his virtual meeting for his class on his iPad, and then he does his work on his laptop. And going to virtual school removed so many barriers for Adam because he isn't there physically and the staff don't need to help him that way. But it also presented new challenges. So in virtual high school, the communication all happens in chat. But for someone who can't enter text quickly and has difficulty scrolling on the laptop or the iPad to keep up, it means that it's really a challenge for Adam to participate in the conversations that way. So ultimately, I'm pointing out that experience of those with diverse abilities are really all unique, and they present different design challenges that can make or break the effectiveness of a design. So what can we do? We can continue our efforts, really looking at enabling people who are designing with information, ensuring that the message is getting out there, maintaining the empathy that we have, using the tools that exist and continuing to build on them where needed. And really what we want to do is cover all of the principles of inclusive design, recognize exclusion, solve for one, and extend to many. And really, when you do that, this benefits people universally, and we can learn from diversity. So look at the way we work. How can we change for the better, and what habits need changing? With our research, let's identify and hear from people whose perspectives we haven't heard from. With the stories and experiences collected, let's share those more effectively. Video has proven to be really effective, more effective than text in our lenses so far. So how could we, in our accessibility lenses, we have videos of people who are using technology who have diverse abilities, and that's been shown in the people who are using it, that it really helps them identify better. So how could we use video differently, and how could we use it maybe more pervasively? Add diversity to our teams, so different voices are heard in-house as well as from people that we're designing for, and really consider our choices and our steps. Shift the cycle to inclusion one choice at a time. So this is a quote from Kat Holmes, who wrote the book Mismatch. She's a well-known advocate for inclusive design, and I highly recommend her book. So the crux is that we really need to hear the missing voices and expertise. So if we have that, we can understand from the lived experience what the rules of engagement are. Those voices and expertise are what lead to empathy for designers. So as I was saying when I first started speaking, Herman and I worked on our initiative separately, and it was only when we started actually comparing notes and talking to each other about what we were doing that it became apparent there was so much crossover and overlap in how we could approach our respective challenges in racial equity and accessibility spaces. And it raised a lot of questions, and some of them are noted here. but we really look to shifting our viewpoint to inclusive lenses rather than the specific things to think about how inclusive lenses might look like. How could we collectively do a better job of understanding the lived experiences of others and overcome the challenges that are inherent with this? So I'm going to pass it back over to Herman to talk about what's come out of our partnership and where we're going next within IBM.
Okay, thanks, Joan. So let's generalize this. Let's zoom back out a bit. We can see that the benefits of implementing inclusive design can be extended to much more than able and racial justice. The diversity wheel shown here is a tool used by Johns Hopkins University. The traits in the middle of the wheel refer to innate traits. They're things that we're born with or that are out of our realm of choice or control. Things like race, ethnicity, mental, physical ability, age, gender, identity expression, gender, national origin, and sexual orientation. The traits or factors on the outside of the wheel refer to aspects of diversity that are related to our environment. These are subject to our life situations and or to personal decisions that may or may not be in our realm of control, and are often impacted by the issues of injustice that relate to innate traits. These traits and factors thereby impact a person's or people's personal and collective lived experiences. If we think a bit about it, the lived experience can also govern and amplify the experience of future generations as well. So this is an important thing to look at, right? These are important considerations here. So for example, racial injustices can impact environmental factors such as education, income, work experience, and amplifying the injustices in that layer, impacting the overall lived experience and setting up subsequent generations with a further disadvantaged start. Conversely, gender advantages can also impact environmental factors, amplifying the advantages of that layer, and then impact the overall lived experience and setting up subsequent generations with a head start. So inclusive design aims to level the playing field and addresses injustices at any and every level of this diversity wheel. Now let's look at a tool that we use at IBM. IBM Design uses the enterprise design thinking loop as a tool to elevate and systemically promote and practice great design at the speed and scale of business. So using it encourages the practice of relentless reinvention, iteratively progressing through a framework of observing users and their behaviors within their environments, reflecting on that user research, and then quickly prototyping at various levels of fidelity to create great outcomes to a variety of problem spaces. So if we map that and we contemplate, we looked at how we might be able to tackle the issue of creating empathy for the lived experience. We involved our racial equity and design community, and we noticed that we could map the input of the feedback we received into 3 areas that correlated with phases of the loop. The first being that observation can be achieved by exposing the stories that convey and amplify the lived experience. The second, in place of reflection, is the act of enabling and making space for inclusive design. And lastly, in the place of making, we look to creatively affect the culture of inclusivity. All right. So in all, 42 members of the racial equity and design community responded to our call for action. And these are the challenge statements that we presented to them as prompts. How might we create empathy for the lived experience? How might we infuse inclusivity into the practice of design? What are our ethical responsibilities and the scope of control that we have as designers? And how might we create a better way to promote inclusivity through the tools of our craft? So charging them with that, we looked at how guilds are used as a construct that we use within IBM to drive programs forward and bring together interested parties that are aligned on accomplishing a distinct goal. We've been contemplating that we could use the community responses to create 3 mandates for an inclusive design guild. The first mandate would be to expose the stories of these lived experiences and to establish empathy. Some of the community ideas offered included first-person testimonials, ensuring access to a diversity of users, insightful education, and increased exposure to cultural mosaics and speakers and written stories. We would also hope to become intentional about our diversity of user research cohorts and develop structured and required inclusive design education. Second, the second mandate would be to enable inclusive design by rethinking how we design. Some of the areas put forward included user research to bolster and validate the extent to which the lived experience gap exists, activating design methods to communicate and recognize these gaps, reinventing our approaches to ensure open, inclusive design practices, and building awareness of and becoming sensitive to conversation censorship. And then lastly, drawing attention to overlooked populations. The final mandate would be to affect a culture of inclusivity through intention and systemic organizational growth. These areas consisted of building a culture of inclusivity and recognition within design itself and within IBM as an organization. Evolve our operational objective and key results, or OKRs, to communicate business impacts of inclusive design, such as client trust and buy-in, similar to how we would with sustainability metrics. Better support for international markets and more ingenuity and innovation driven by diverse perspectives would be the result of this. Establishing inclusivity as part of the DNA and design culture, as Joan had noted, within IBM, and creating time and safe spaces for these discussions. So our thought is to actually spin up an inclusive design guild as one of these safe spaces to have these discussions. Okay, now we would love to hear from you. What